Hello, everyone. I am the Sleep Storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The world was young when the first embers stirred in the darkness. It was a time before the sun and the moon, before the measure of days and nights, when the land lay hushed beneath the stars. The Valor, mighty and eternal, shaped the world with hands of power, and with them walked the Maiar, spirits of light and wisdom. Some were as gentle as the whispering wind, as fluid as the coursing rivers, but among them were those whose spirits burned hottest, beings of fire, of passion, of might. They danced upon the peaks of mountains, their forms flickering like living flames, their laughter ringing like the crackling of embers in the night. They were not yet creatures of ruin, but of raw creation, woven from the very essence of flame itself. The greatest among them bore a name that would echo through time, Meron, whom the ages would call Sauron. But there was another, one whose name would become wreathed in dread and shadow. His presence was vast, his power unmatched, and in the darkest annals of history, he would be known as Gothmog, Lord of the Balrogs. Yet in these first days, they were untainted, luminous as all things once were. They were kindled from the secret fire, the very essence of life that Eru Ilúvatar had placed at the heart of existence. They roamed the world in wonder, their flames flickering in harmony with the song of creation. But not all who walked the young earth were content. Among the Valor was Melkor, the mightiest of them all, whose ambition knew no limit. He had wandered the void before the world was shaped, searching in vain for the imperishable flame, the power that would allow him to create life of his own. When he found it beyond his grasp, his desire twisted into resentment, and his heart turned against his kin. No longer did he seek to build, only to conquer, to bend the world to his own dominion. And he was not alone. There were those who had grown restless, spirits drawn to his might, those who longed not for harmony, but for rule. Among these were the fire dancers, the spirits of flame who had once brought light to the heavens. Under Melkor's will, their fire darkened, no longer radiant with the light of creation, but wreathed in shadow and wrath. They became something new, something terrible demons of ruin, bound to the will of a dark lord. Thus, the Balrogs were born. From the farthest reaches of the world, they followed him, descending into the black halls of Utumno, Melkor's great fortress in the north. There, beneath the weight of the world, their fires grew hotter, their forms shifting from luminous spirits into creatures of destruction. No longer did they dance upon the peaks, they brooded in the abyss, sharpening their power in secret. The lands above lay untouched, unknowing of what stirred beneath. The firstborn children of Ilúvatar, the elves, awoke beside the still waters of Cúvainen, their eyes wide with wonder at the starlit sky. They did not know that far beneath their feet, in the chasms of the world, shadows moved. When Melkor struck against the world, It was the Balrogs who led the charge. They came not like creeping shadows, but in a torrent of fire and blackened smoke, their whips lashing like serpents of flame, their presence blotting out the stars. The lands that had been green and fair were scorched, their beauty seared away beneath the wrath of the Dark Lord's host. The elves, who had known only peace, trembled at the coming of the storm, for they had never seen such horror. The first war of Middle-earth had begun, and in that war, the name of Gothmog became legend. He was the mightiest of his kind, a being of relentless fury, his form towering and wreathed in shadow, his strength like an unchained inferno. In one hand, he bore a whip of many thongs, each lash trailing fire as it cracked through the air. In the other, an axe black as night, its edge keener than any mortal forge could craft. With these weapons, he carved through the hosts of the Valor when they finally rose to stand against Melkor, sundering the battlefield with every blow. The ground itself seemed to quake beneath his steps, and where he passed, only ruin remained. But even the mightiest could not stand when the wrath of the Valor fell in full force. The world trembled as they waged war against Melkor, a battle so fierce that it reshaped the land itself. Mountains were cast down, rivers changed their course, and in the heart of that ruin, Utumno was broken open. The Dark Lord was dragged forth in chains, bound in shackles of unbreakable steel, and cast into the void, imprisoned beyond the reach of time. The world, it seemed, had been saved, yet the Balrogs did not fall with him. As the towers of Utumno crumbled, they fled, retreating into the deepest places of the world, where no light could follow. They burrowed into forgotten caverns, into fissures beneath the mountains, where the warmth of the earth still whispered to them. There, in the suffocating dark, they lay still, their flames dwindling, but never extinguished. They did not perish, nor did they despair, for they were fire, and fire does not die. It smolders, it waits, and so they remained, hidden in the forgotten hollows of the earth, while above them the world moved on. The elves built their cities beneath the stars. The first kingdoms of men rose from the dust, and the dwarves carved halls of stone deep into the mountains, never knowing what slept beneath them. Ages passed, but the Balrogs had not forgotten. The world above may have changed, but fire does not change. It consumes, it devours. It is, and it always will be. And in the darkness, Gothmog and his kin waited, knowing that one day the call would come again. One day the world would burn once more, deep beneath the mountains, where no light had ever touched. The Balrogs lay hidden in silence. It was not the silence of peace, nor the stillness of death, but something far older, something that had existed before time had been measured. In the depths of the world, where fire still pulsed through the veins of the stone like lifeblood in a slumbering beast, they remained watching, waiting. The world above them had forgotten, had turned its face from fire, had written their existence into stories meant to frighten children. But fire does not die because it is ignored. It smolders beneath the ashes, unseen, until the wind stirs it to life once more. And then the wind came. Far above them, the world was changing. The name of Melkor had been struck from the tongues of elves and men, replaced by another Morgoth, the Black Foe. He had returned, his will stretching across Middle-earth like a creeping shadow, poisoning the hearts of those who would listen. And with his return, the Balrogs stirred in the depths, their embers rekindled by the whisper of their master's voice. One by one they awoke, the darkness around them trembling as their fires blazed anew. And when they rose, the world above burned. They came forth in fire and ruin, emerging from the deepest chasms, from forgotten places where only death had walked. Morgoth's armies swept across the land, blackening the sky with smoke, and at their head rode Gothmog, his towering form wreathed in shadow and flame. His whip cracked through the air, his axe rose and fell like a storm of fire, and wherever he went, hope withered. He was the terror in the darkness, the doom in the wake of Morgoth's war, and no force of men or elves could match his fury. The great kingdoms of the elves stood against them, their banners flying high, their swords gleaming in the light of the stars. The Noldor, proud and mighty, led by their high king, took the fight to Morgoth's gates. But the Balrogs did not fear kings. They had been shaped for war, forged in the darkness of Utumno itself, and the greatest of elven lords fell before them. It was in these battles that the name of Gothmog became legend, not only among his foes, but among those who followed him. At the Dagger Nuin Goliath, the battle under the stars, he struck down Fëanor, the greatest of the Noldor, the craftsman of the Silmarils. The elf lord had burned with a fire that few could match, a spirit unyielding even in the face of darkness. But Gothmog was fire itself, and he did not yield. He waged battle against Fëanor, his axe clashing against the elven blade, his whip lashing through the air like a serpent of flame. The mountains trembled with their fury. The sky was painted with embers, and when the duel ended, Fëanor lay dying upon the broken earth, his body charred, his strength spent. But even in victory, Gothmog did not relent. He crushed the Noldor's hopes beneath his heel, driving them back, letting them know that their brightest light had been snuffed out. War raged on, and the Balrogs did not falter. The great siege of Angband, Morgoth's fortress, stretched across centuries, and through the long years, Gothmog remained at the heart of the storm. When the gates of Morgoth's stronghold were finally thrown open, it was he who led the charge, his warriors pouring forth like a flood of fire. Battle after battle, the free peoples of Middle-earth stood against them. But against the tide of shadow, even the strongest began to fall. It was in the Nirneath Arnodiad, the battle of unnumbered tears, that Gothmog claimed his greatest victory. The elves and men, united in defiance, had marched upon Morgoth's forces, seeking to end the darkness once and for all. Their banners rose high, their horns sounded across the battlefield, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. But then the earth split open, and from the depths, the Balrogs emerged. Like a tide of living flame, they swept into the fray, their whips searing through armor, their weapons cutting down all who stood before them. The battle was long and merciless, but in the end, the might of Morgoth's forces proved too great. The free peoples were broken, their armies shattered, and in the chaos of the slaughter, Gothmog himself struck down Fingon, High King of the Noldor. The Elven King had fought valiantly, his sword flashing with the light of the stars, but Gothmog was relentless. He struck him down with his axe, his whip coiling around him like a serpent of fire, and with a final, brutal blow, he ended Fingon's life. And with that, the hope of the Noldor crumbled. Morgoth's dominions spread across Middle-earth, and the Balrogs stood as his enforcers, his champions of ruin. The world had learned to fear them, had learned that there was no sanctuary from their wrath. They were destruction incarnate, fire unchained, and wherever they walked, only ashes remained. But even the greatest flames can be extinguished. As the ages passed, the tide of war began to shift. The valor, the mighty powers of the world, could not stand idle while darkness consumed all. And so, from across the sea, they came with the fury of the West, an army that shook the very foundation of the earth. The war of wrath had begun, and with it, the end of Morgoth's reign. For the first time, the Balrogs knew fear. They had battled elves and men, had waged war against kingdoms and empires, but never had they faced the full might of the valor. The sky burned with the fires of battle. The land was torn asunder. And in that final war, the Balrogs fell one by one, driven back into the abyss. And in the heart of the carnage, Gothmog, Lord of the Balrogs, met his end. He fought until the last, his whip striking, his axe cleaving through the host of the valor. But even he could not stand against Ernwe, the mightiest of the Maiar, the herald of the valor. Their battle raged like a storm, fire against light, destruction against judgment. But in the end, Gothmog was struck down, and with him, the age of the Balrogs came to an end. Those who survived fled into the deepest caverns, into the forgotten places of the world, where even the light of the stars could not reach. There they slumbered, their flames dimmed but not extinguished. They were not gone. They were only waiting, and deep beneath the mountains, in the dark places of the world, a whisper stirred a memory of fire, a promise of ruin one day. The world would remember them again. One day, the fire would rise. The world above moved on, unaware of the darkness that still lingered beneath its feet. The great wars had ended. Morgoth had been cast beyond the world's edge into the void, and the Balrogs had been driven into the deepest caverns, lost to time. The scars of battle remained, carved into the very bones of Middle-earth. But the free peoples rejoiced, believing that the last shadow had been banished. But fire does not die so easily. In the forsaken depths, where the weight of the mountains pressed down like an unyielding hand, the remnants of the Balrogs lay hidden. They did not stir, did not speak, did not move. They were bound to the world, unable to leave it as their master had. But they had not perished. They had only been buried beneath the weight of centuries, slumbering in the hollowed ruins of their ancient strongholds. The world above had forgotten them, but they had not forgotten the world. Among them was one who had known the glory of the past, who who had marched beneath the banners of Morgoth, who had watched Gothmog strike down the kings of elves. This one had not fallen in the War of Wrath, had not been slain by the Valor's fury. No, this one had fled deeper than any other into the black places where no mortal foot had ever trod. There, it had remained, waiting, remembering. And then something changed. At first, it was only a tremor, so slight that it might have been mistaken for the restless shifting of the earth. The Balrog did not stir, did not acknowledge it. The world above had been restless before, had moved and changed and crumbled while it lay silent beneath the stone. But then came the sound, faint, distant, but undeniable. It was not the voice of a master long lost, nor the call of battle, but something smaller, something living. It was the echo of footsteps, intruders. For the first time in an age, the Balrog opened its eyes. They were not eyes in the way that mortals understood them. There was no pupil, no iris, no light reflected within them. They were only fire, deep and smoldering, burning slow and low like embers buried beneath the ashes of a long-dead war. A single breath stirred the air, thick with the scent of burning rock, and the very cavern seemed to tremble in response. It had slept for too long. Far above, in the halls of Khazad-dum, the dwarves worked their great forges, their hammers ringing against stone, their laughter echoing through the mighty caverns they had carved from the mountain's heart. They were a proud people, tireless in their craft, relentless in their pursuit of wealth and mastery over stone and metal. And yet, for all their wisdom, for all their skill, they had grown blind to the danger that lay beneath them, for they had delved too deep. Driven by greed, they cut deeper into the mountain, hewing through rock in search of mithril, the most precious of all metals. They had found veins of silver that shone like starlight, had uncovered wealth beyond imagining. But with each strike of their picks, they came closer to something else, something buried in the forgotten dark, something that should have remained undisturbed. And then, with a single stroke of metal against stone, they broke through. The air that rushed forth was thick with heat, with the scent of fire long smothered, and the dwarves faltered, their torches flickering in the sudden gust. The cavern before them was vast, stretching beyond the reach of their light, its walls blackened as if scorched by a fire that had burned an age ago. The ground was cracked, jagged, as though something had stirred here once and left the rock broken in its wake. And then, from the darkness, came a sound, not the whisper of shifting stone, nor the sigh of air moving through the depths, but something deeper, something older. It was a breath, drawn slow and deliberate, a thing that had not known movement for centuries, but now began to wake. The shadows deepened, thickened, pressing against the light of the dwarves' torches, swallowing the edges of their vision. Then the flames dimmed. One by one, their torches flickered, their light smothered not by wind, not by cold, but by something else, something alive. The darkness was not merely absence, it was a presence, a weight that bore down upon them, pressing into their bones. And within that darkness, 2 burning embers flared to life. The dwarves did not scream, not at first. They stood frozen, their minds unable to grasp what they saw, what they had awoken. It was not a creature, not in the way they understood. It was not flesh, nor bone, nor mortal sinew wrapped in armor. It was something older than their halls, older than their people, older than the mountains themselves. It was fire and shadow, destruction made flesh, and it was rising. With a slow, deliberate movement, the Balrog lifted its head. The rock beneath it cracked, its surface blackening further beneath the heat that rolled off its form in waves. The air itself shimmered, twisting and warping around it, as if recoiling from the sheer force of its presence. And then, with the sound of thunder rolling through the cavern, it rose to its full height. The dwarves ran. They turned and fled, their shouts echoing through the tunnels, their hurried footsteps a frantic, uneven rhythm against the stone. Some dropped their torches, some abandoned their tools, but it did not matter. None of it mattered. The fire had woken, and there would be no escape. Behind them, the cavern was no longer silent. Flames roared to life, licking at the walls, filling the tunnel with a light that was not warm, not inviting, but hungry. The shadows stretched, writhing like living things, as if drawn to the heat, as if feeding upon it. The Balrog moved forward, each step sending tremors through the stone, each motion a slow, deliberate inevitability. It did not run. It did not need to. The dwarves had disturbed something they could not hope to understand, something that had slumbered since the fall of Morgoth, since the world had last been drowned in shadow. They had believed themselves the masters of stone, the rulers of the depths, but the depths belonged to the darkness, and now the darkness had returned. Deep within Khazad-dum, the bells rang. The dwarves had awoken something they could not contain, and now they called to one another in warning, in fear. But their voices were nothing against the roar of fire, against the deep, thunderous growl that rolled through the tunnels like the voice of the mountain itself. The halls of Khazad-dum trembled as the fire surged through the ancient tunnels, consuming the air, twisting the very shadows into writhing specters of heat and ash. The dwarves fled, their once proud kingdom echoing with cries of alarm, with the ringing of warning bells that could not hope to drown out the deep, thunderous growl that came from the abyss. They had awakened something beyond their reckoning, something that had waited for an age beneath the stone, and now it was free. The Balrog moved with the slow inevitability of a tide, its form a shifting mass of fire and shadow, its great wings unfurling, not as a bird would, but as a storm that blackened the sky. The heat that rolled from its body made the stone weep, cracks running through the mighty pillars of Durin's halls as the very mountain recoiled from its presence. It had no need for haste. Fear would do its work for it. The dwarves knew their doom had come. Durin, king of Khazad-dum, stood upon the bridge, his eyes filled not with terror, but with fury. His ancestors had built this place, had carved it from the bones of the world itself, and he would not abandon it to ruin. In his hands, his great axe gleamed in the firelight, its edge keen, its surface etched with runes of power that had stood for generations. He would not run. He was Durin, and his people looked to him for strength. The Balrog regarded him, its burning eyes narrowing as if in recognition, as if it had seen this before the defiance of kings, the last stand of warriors who knew they would fall, but refused to yield. It had seen it in the wars of old, in the battles of Morgoth, in the final moments of the great lords of elves and men who had dared to stand before it. And it had seen them all burn. With a sound like the splitting of the earth, the Balrog moved, its whip of fire lashing through the air, cracking against the bridge in a shower of molten rock. Durin leapt back, his axe flashing as he struck, the blade biting into the fiery tendril, sending sparks scattering like dying stars. The dwarves watching from the far side of the hall held their breath, gripping their weapons, but none dared to step forward. This was not a foe that could be bested by courage alone. This was an ancient thing, a remnant of an age long past, and in its presence, even the bravest knew fear. The Balrog did not falter. It stepped onto the bridge, its great clawed feet blackening the stone beneath them, its massive form filling the vastness of the cavern. Heat rolled from its body in waves, the air shimmering with its presence. Durin charged, his axe swinging in a mighty arc, and for a moment, it seemed as if the weapon might strike true, might carve into the darkness and drive it back. But the Balrog was not made of flesh and blood. It was fire and shadow, a being of destruction itself. And as the axe met its form, the blade merely passed through, leaving only a trail of flame in its wake. Then came the counterstrike. The Balrog's whip lashed out, coiling around Durin's arm, searing through metal and flesh alike. He gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out, but the pain was beyond mortal endurance. With a single motion, the demon pulled, and the king staggered forward, his footing slipping on the scorched stone. The Balrog raised its other hand, claws like obsidian blades descending, and in an instant, Durin was struck down, his body crumpled to the bridge, his axe clattering beside him, the firelight dancing upon the runes that no longer held meaning. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness itself. The dwarves who had stood watching felt their hearts shatter, their very spirits break. Durin, their king, their strength, had fallen. The Balrog turned its gaze toward them, and in that moment, they knew their home was lost. There was no victory to be won here, no hope of reclaiming what had already been claimed by fire. Khazad-dum, the greatest of their halls, would belong to the dark. The dwarves fled. They abandoned the deep halls, the mighty forges, the golden hoards that had taken generations to amass. They left behind their dead, their history, their pride, for nothing could stand against the doom that had come upon them. The Balrog did not pursue them. It had no need. This was its domain now, the ruins of a once great kingdom reduced to a tomb of ash and silence. It moved through the halls, the flickering light of its form casting monstrous shadows upon the towering pillars, its presence warping the very air with heat. It did not think as mortal creatures thought, did not dwell upon its past or its purpose. It was fire, and fire did not question. It only consumed. Years passed, and the halls of Khazad-dum were silent. The laughter of dwarves, the ringing of hammers upon anvils, the songs that had once echoed through the stone gone, all of it swallowed by the dark. The Balrog remained, a lingering ember of an age long buried, its existence a secret whispered only in fear. The world above had moved on. Kingdoms rose and fell, wars were waged and won, but in the depths of the mountains, the fire still burned. The name of Khazad-dum faded from the tongues of men and elves. It became a place of shadow, a cursed land known only by a new name, Moria, a place abandoned, a place where none dared tread. And in its heart, the Balrog waited. It did not age, did not wane, did not slumber as it once had. It had no master, no lord to call upon it, but it did not need one. The darkness was enough. The silence was enough. The fire did not die. It only waited for the day it would rise again. Time passed like a river, carving its way through stone, unyielding and inevitable. The world above shifted and changed, kingdoms rising only to fall. Names that once carried power fading into mere whispers of legend. Yet beneath it all, beneath the towering mountains and the green forests and the cities built by mortal hands, there was a place where time did not move as it did in the lands of light. Deep in the forsaken halls of Moria, the fire still smoldered, undisturbed by the passing of ages. The Balrog had no need for haste, no reason to stir. It had driven the dwarves from their halls, had reduced Khazad-dum to a silent tomb, and that was enough. It waited for what it did not know. Fire does not dream, does not seek, does not wonder. It simply is, bound to its own existence, waiting for something, anything, to set it free. But the world had not truly forgotten. Though the name of Moria had become one spoken only in hushed voices, though the once mighty halls of the dwarves had turned to a kingdom of ghosts, there were still those who remembered. There were always those who hungered for the secrets buried beneath the stone, those who sought to claim what had been left behind. And so they came, not elves, who would never set foot in a place so tainted by shadow, nor men, who had little need for the wealth hidden in the dark. It was the dwarves who returned first. They were a stubborn people, bound to the bones of the earth as surely as the mountains themselves. The halls of their ancestors called to them, the promise of mithril, of lost treasures, of old glories waiting to be reclaimed. The whispers of fire and shadow were not enough to keep them away. They came in small numbers at first, scouting the ruins, testing the paths that had long been swallowed by the dark. The great gates of Moria stood open, the threshold to a place that had once been alive with song and industry, now standing like the mouth of an abyss, yawning wide in silent warning. The first dwarves to enter did so cautiously, their torches casting flickering light upon the carved walls, their footsteps echoing through chambers that had not heard a living soul in an age. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of years, with something unseen pressing against the edges of their senses. And then there was movement, not the shifting of stone, not the whisper of wind through the tunnels, but something deeper, something that did not belong. A presence, a weight in the darkness, vast and unseen, felt rather than heard. It was not yet awake, not yet fully stirred, but it was listening, watching. The dwarves pressed on deeper and deeper, past the ruined halls of their ancestors, past the broken bridges and the forgotten forges. They marveled at the veins of mithril still gleaming in the stone, at the golden hoards left untouched, at the splendor that had been abandoned to dust and silence. They believed they had come home. They did not know they had already been noticed. Days passed, and the dwarves grew bolder. They lit new fires in the forges, began the work of reclaiming what had been lost. Their numbers grew as more of their kin returned, drawn by the promise of what lay beneath the mountain. They set their hammers to stone, their voices rising once more in songs of old, the echoes of their ancestors filling the halls once more. But in the depths of Moria, where even torchlight could not reach, something stirred. The Balrog had not moved in an age, had known only stillness, only the weight of the dark pressing in around it. But now, that dark was no longer silent. There was a rhythm in the halls once more, the sound of voices, of life, of something that did not belong. It did not remember the years that had passed, did not think of how long it had been since it had last risen. But fire does not need to think. Fire only burns. The tremor was small at first, so slight that the dwarves dismissed it as nothing more than the restless groaning of the earth. A shift in the mountain, a settling of old stone. But then came another, then another. The forges shook. The great pillars that held up the vast halls of Khazad-dum quivered as something ancient exhaled its first breath in centuries. The air thickened with heat, with the scent of burning rock, with the promise of something waking. And then the shadows deepened. It began in the farthest reaches of Moria, in the forgotten tunnels that no dwarf had yet dared to tread. The torches that had been placed there flickered, their flames trembling as if caught in an unseen wind. Then, one by one, they died, swallowed by the dark, smothered by something vast and unseen. The dwarves who were nearest felt it first, not with their eyes, not with their ears, but in their bones, a presence. It had awoken. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing against their chests, making it difficult to breathe. The darkness that filled the tunnels was no longer empty. It had weight, it had form, it had will. A whisper ran through the depths, a soundless thing that was not heard, but felt a promise, a warning, a memory of ruin and fire. And then there were the eyes. 2 points of burning light flared to life in the blackness, deep within the tunnels, where no living thing had stood in an age. They were not eyes in the way the dwarves understood them, for there was no mercy, no thought, no life behind them, only fire. A fire that had slumbered, that had waited, and now, at long last, had been given reason to rise. The first scream echoed through the halls of Moria. It was followed by another, another. The dwarves who had ventured into the deepest tunnels came running, their faces pale, their voices raw with terror. They spoke of something massive, something that had no shape and yet filled the space entirely, something that had woken beneath the mountain and now moved toward them. The forges dimmed. The songs of the dwarves fell silent, and then from the depths came the roar. It was a sound that did not belong to the world of the living, a sound that shook the very foundations of Khazad-dum, that sent stones tumbling from the heights of the halls, that drove a cold terror into the hearts of even the bravest dwarves. The mountain itself seemed to shudder as fire erupted from the blackness, as heat rolled through the tunnels like a storm given form. The Balrog had returned. It moved forward, slow and deliberate, its great limbs unfurling, its whip of flame trailing behind it like a serpent of living fire. It did not need to chase the dwarves, did not need to rush. Panic had already taken them, their discipline broken, their lines shattered. They had come seeking wealth, seeking glory, believing they could reclaim what had been lost. But they had forgotten. Moria did not belong to them. Not anymore. It belonged to the dark. It belonged to the fire. And now, the fire would take back what was its own. The halls of Moria trembled with the weight of its forgotten master's return. Fire roared through the darkness, filling the ancient corridors with a searing heat that made the very stone weep. The dwarves, who had once sung songs of triumph and reclamation, now screamed as they fled, their torches nothing but feeble glimmers against the encroaching abyss. They had come to awaken their lost kingdom, but instead, they had roused something far older, far deadlier. The Balrog did not pursue them with haste. It did not need to. It moved with slow, unyielding purpose, its vast form a shifting mass of black flame and writhing shadow. It had waited for an age in silence, bound to the deep places of the world, its fire merely smoldering beneath the weight of centuries. But now, the silence had been broken, and fire, once disturbed, could not be contained. The first to fall were those closest to the black chasm from which the demon had risen. The heat alone was enough to drive them back, their flesh blistering, their armor searing against their bodies as the Balrog's presence consumed the air around them. Some collapsed where they stood, their breath stolen by the overwhelming force of the inferno. Others turned to run, but their movements were sluggish, their legs weak beneath them as fear and exhaustion overtook them. Those who could still cry out called for their kin, for their king, for their ancestors, but no salvation came. The Balrog's whip lashed out, a streak of burning light in the dark, striking down those who lingered too long, their bodies thrown aside like broken dolls. Their weapons were useless. Their axes, their hammers, their swords, they were crafted for battle against flesh and steel, not against something that was neither living nor dead, something that was pure destruction given form. Deeper into Moria the survivors fled, their footsteps thundering through the once proud halls, their voices rising in desperate commands. To the gates, to the gates. But the way was long, the tunnels winding and vast. And though they knew these halls better than any, terror clouded their senses. The mighty bridges that had once connected the heart of their kingdom now stood as crumbling remnants of a lost age, their paths treacherous, their stones slick with time's decay. Some dwarves slipped in their haste, plunging into the depths below, their cries lost in the abyss. Others made it across, their hearts pounding as the realization set in this was no longer their home. It was a tomb. Above them, the great doors of Moria loomed in the distance, the last barrier between them and the world beyond. The sunlight that seeped through the cracks in the stone seemed impossibly far, its warmth a distant memory against the all-consuming heat that pressed in from behind. They could not see it yet, but they could feel it. The Balrog was still coming. It did not rush. It did not need to. The halls of Moria belonged to it now, and the dwarves were nothing but fleeting embers in the storm of its awakening. Then came the final scream. One of the dwarves, a warrior clad in the finest armor their forges had ever crafted, turned at the threshold of escape. Perhaps it was bravery, perhaps it was madness, but he stood, axe in hand, his breath ragged as he faced the advancing darkness. He called upon his ancestors, upon the name of Durin, upon all that his people had built, and with one final cry he charged. The Balrog did not stop. It did not falter. It did not even acknowledge his challenge. Its whip cracked once through the air, a single blinding arc of fire, and when it passed, the dwarf was no more. The last survivors burst through the gates of Moria, their faces pale, their bodies shaking with the weight of what they had seen. They turned only once, their eyes lingering on the darkness beyond the threshold, and for a moment all was still. Then, deep within the halls, a sound rumbled forth, not a roar, not a scream, but something worse. Laughter. Not the laughter of men nor elves, nor anything of mortal kind. It was a sound that belonged to the first wars, to the time before the sun, to a force that had once served the greatest darkness the world had ever known. It was the laughter of fire, of something that had waited in slumber, and now knew that it would never need to sleep again. The great doors slammed shut, sealing the abyss within. But the dwarves knew the truth. It was not contained. It was merely waiting. The survivors spread the tale, their voices carrying the warning across Middle-earth. Moria was lost. The halls of their fathers were no more. The name of their kingdom, once spoken with pride, was now whispered only in dread. The Balrog had claimed its dominion, and none would dare challenge it. And so, for many long years, Moria lay abandoned, its halls filled with silence once more. But this was no longer the silence of forgotten halls, nor the quiet of an empty kingdom. This was the silence of fire waiting to rise again. Darkness swallowed Moria, thick and suffocating, deeper than the absence of light. It was a living thing pressing against the ancient stone, coiling through the ruined halls, seeping into the cracks and crevices where time itself seemed to slow. The Balrog did not stir. It did not need to. It had won. Khazad-dum belonged to it now, not by conquest, but by inevitability. The dwarves had fled, their songs and forges silenced, their footsteps erased from the dust of ages. All that remained was the deep, endless quiet of the void. But within that silence, the fire still burned. It had no purpose, no master, no battle to fight, and yet it endured. A remnant of an age before memory, a shadow cast from a war that had shaped the very bones of the world. It did not hunger, did not tire, did not think as mortals did, but it remembered. It remembered fire and fury, remembered the screams of elves and men as they fell before its kind, remembered the name of Morgoth whispered in reverence. That name was gone now, lost to the void beyond the world, but the Balrog remained. And fire does not die. It only waits. Years passed, then decades, then centuries, but the deep halls of Moria did not change. The once magnificent stairways and towering bridges lay cracked and crumbling, the golden forges buried beneath dust and ruin. The great statues of Durin and his line stood watch over emptiness, their stone faces worn by time, their eyes blind to the creeping decay that swallowed their kingdom. But none came to reclaim it. None dared. The world above moved on, the kingdoms of men and elves rising and falling like waves against the shore. But no one set foot in the black pit. It was cursed. It was forgotten. It was a tomb. Yet not all things that walk in the light know fear. Others came, not dwarves, not elves, not the proud lords of men, but lesser things, drawn by the promise of darkness. Creatures that scurried in the shadows, that whispered in tongues not meant for mortal ears. Goblins, orcs, twisted remnants of Morgoth's foul work, had crept back into the abandoned halls, burrowing into its vastness like maggots into a corpse. They did not know what lay beneath, did not understand what slumbered within the deep places of the mountain. To them, Moria was nothing but endless tunnels, a fortress waiting to be claimed, a labyrinth of stone and shadow in which they could thrive. They built their nests in the ruins, lit their torches against the darkness, and for a time, it seemed as if life, wretched though it was, had returned to the lost halls. But the Balrog did not wake. It did not see them as a threat. They were insects, insignificant scurrying things, not warriors, not kings, not those who had once stood against its fire. They fought among themselves, spilled blood across the cracked stone, raised crude banners, and called themselves rulers of a place that had never belonged to them. They did not understand that they lived beneath the gaze of something that did not need to see them to know they were there. And so they fought, and they bled, and they died. And still, the Balrog remained in its abyss, coiled in shadow, waiting for something greater. But fire is patient, and fate is cruel. The world above still held its own wars, its own struggles, and in time, its battles would reach even the depths of Moria. A new shadow was rising in the east, a darkness that whispered of an old power stirring again. And in its wake, the world trembled. The orcs in Moria began to grow restless. Whispers of a master unseen carried through their tunnels, the promise of war and dominion spreading like a plague among them. They did not know who it was that called them, nor did they care. All that mattered was the rising storm, the voice in the dark that demanded allegiance. They sharpened their blades, strengthened their numbers, prepared for the day when they would pour forth from their tunnels like a tide of rot and ruin. They did not yet understand that the halls they now claimed were not theirs to rule, and deep beneath them, in the forgotten chambers of fire and ash, the Balrog stirred. It was not awake, not fully, not yet, but something had shifted in the world. A presence, a call that was not a voice, but a feeling, an echo of a time long past. It did not know the name of this new shadow, did not care for the wars of the world above, but it felt the weight of something vast pressing against the edges of its slumber. It did not think of Morgoth, did not wonder if its old master's will had found a way back into the world. The Balrog did not think in such terms. It only knew that something was reaching toward the darkness, stirring the embers of a fire that had lain buried for too long. And fire, once roused, cannot be ignored. The orcs above did not yet know what lay beneath them, did not understand what it meant when the air in the deepest tunnels began to thicken with heat, when the rock itself seemed to grow heavy with something unseen. They would soon learn. Moria had never belonged to them. It had never belonged to the dwarves who had carved it from the stone, nor to the kings who had ruled within its halls. It belonged only to the dark. It belonged to the fire. And soon, the fire would rise again. The air in Moria thickened, heavy with something unseen, something ancient, something waiting. The orcs who had claimed the halls as their own did not notice at first. They were too consumed by their own wars, their own feuds, their ceaseless hunger for blood and conquest. They spread through the tunnels like a disease, scarring the stone with their filth, defiling the once great kingdom of the dwarves with their crude carvings and wretched fires. They thought themselves masters of this place, rulers of the depths. They did not know they were trespassers. They did not know they were being watched. The Balrog did not stir, not fully, not yet, but it was aware. A presence in the dark, a thing that did not sleep, did not dream, did not think as living creatures did, but simply was. Fire did not question its purpose. Fire only burned. And deep beneath the ruined halls of Khazad-dum, the fire was beginning to wake. The first sign was the heat. It came slowly, creeping through the tunnels, seeping into the cracks of stone, pressing against the air like an invisible hand. The orcs noticed, but they did not understand. They blamed each other, accused their kin of stoking too many fires, of angering something unseen. Some spoke in hushed voices of a shadow in the deep, a presence that had been here before them, before the dwarves, before even the oldest of their kind could remember. They did not dare speak its name. Perhaps they did not know it. Perhaps they did not wish to. But names did not matter. The fire did not need to be named to be feared. The second sign was the silence. The tunnels of Moria had always been filled with noise, the clash of iron, the guttural voices of orcs, the restless stirring of things that lived in the dark. But now, a hush spread through the depths, a quiet so complete it pressed against the ears, against the mind, a silence that was not absence, but presence. The lesser creatures felt it first, the goblins scurrying through the side passages, the rats that had made their burrows in the forgotten corners of the ruins. They vanished, fled. Some were found torn apart, their bodies blackened as if seared by heat that had left no flame behind. The orcs grew uneasy. Their bravest scouts went deeper, into tunnels no living thing had entered in centuries. They did not return. Then came the dreams. The chieftains, the warlords, those who thought themselves rulers of Moria, began to wake in the dead of night, their breaths ragged, their bodies drenched in sweat. They did not know what they had seen, could not remember the shapes that had lurked in the edges of their visions, but they knew what they had felt: heat, fire, a great and terrible weight pressing down upon them, as if the mountain itself had come alive to crush them beneath its will. They whispered of the old stories, the legends of something that had once dwelled in the deep, something that had slain kings and driven the dwarves from their own halls. Some argued it was just a tale, an old fear that did not belong to them, a shadow of a time long past. Others were not so sure, and then, without warning, the ground trembled. It was not an earthquake, not the shifting of stone as Moria settled beneath the weight of the mountain. It was something else, a pulse, a single heartbeat, not of flesh, but of fire. A soundless roar that reverberated through the caverns, shaking the foundations of the ruined kingdom, sending shards of rock cascading from the vaulted ceilings. The orcs scrambled in confusion, some calling for war, others fleeing blindly into the tunnels. They did not know where to run. There was nowhere safe. And then the fire came. It was not a slow awakening, not a gentle flickering of embers from the past. It was an eruption, a storm of heat and shadow that burst forth from the deepest chasms, swallowing the tunnels in flame. The orcs barely had time to scream before it consumed them, their bodies vanishing in the inferno, their weapons melting in their hands. Those who were far enough to escape the first wave turned and ran, their minds shattered by the horror of what they had seen. It was not just fire. It was something within the fire, something vast, something ancient, something that had waited for this moment longer than their kind had existed. And now it was free. The Balrog rose from the abyss. Its form was a shifting mass of black flame and living shadow, its great wings unfurling, not to carry it through the air, but to spread its presence, to consume the light, to devour the very space around it. Its eyes, twin burning voids, swept across the ruined halls, and in them there was no thought, no mercy, only the endless hunger of fire. Its whip cracked through the air, splitting stone, carving molten lines into the walls of the tunnels, a sound like the breaking of the world itself. The survivors of the orc horde, those who had once thought themselves masters of this place, now understood the truth. Moria had never belonged to them. It had never belonged to the dwarves. It had never belonged to any living thing. It belonged to the Balrog. It always had. And now the fire had taken it back. Moria burned. The heat that pulsed from the Balrog's form was not the flickering warmth of a hearth, nor the steady glow of a forge. It was fire in its purest form, wild and unrestrained, a force that had been held in slumber for too long. Now it raged. The orcs who had claimed the halls as their own were nothing before it, their crude banners turning to ash, their weapons glowing red-hot before melting into twisted remnants of steel. Those who had once boasted of their dominion over the depths now fled like insects before a storm, their screams swallowed by the roaring inferno that filled the ancient tunnels. But the Balrog did not pursue them. It had no interest in the scurrying of lesser creatures. It did not hate. It did not hunger. It simply was. Fire did not chase its prey. It did not need to. It consumed all in its path, whether they ran or fought or fell to their knees in despair. The halls of Khazad-dum had belonged to the dwarves once, and the orcs had taken them, but neither had ever been the true masters of this place. Moria had always belonged to the dark. Stone cracked and buckled under the relentless heat, great pillars that had stood for millennia crumbling as if they had been made of sand. Bridges that had once spanned the great chasms of the mountain collapsed into the abyss below, their ruins swallowed by the endless void. The very mountain groaned, as if mourning the destruction, but the Balrog did not hear. It did not listen. The echoes of its own fire drowned out all else, reducing the ancient halls to ruin. But even amidst the carnage, it did not rage without purpose. It was not mindless, not a beast acting upon instinct alone. It was something older, something deeper, a will of flame and shadow given form. And as it stood among the ruins of what had once been the mightiest kingdom of the dwarves, it lifted its burning gaze toward the upper tunnels, toward the world above. The fire had been buried for too long. Far away, beyond the mountains, beyond the endless caverns of Moria, the world still moved, unaware of what had been unleashed. The elves still sang beneath the starlit skies, their voices carrying songs of an age when darkness had been defeated. The men of Gondor stood upon their towers, watching the horizon, believing their vigilance would keep the shadows at bay. Even the dwarves who had long since abandoned their ancestral home carried on, forging their weapons, shaping their stone, never daring to look back toward the kingdom they had lost. None of them knew that the past was not done with them. None of them knew that the fire had never truly died. The Balrog did not care for the world above, not in the way mortals did. It did not long for conquest, nor did it seek dominion over the lands beyond the mountains. But it was fire, and fire does not remain contained forever. It spreads, it devours, it claims all that stands in its path, not out of cruelty, but because that is its nature. And now, after an age of silence, the fire was stirring once more. The tunnels leading upward still stood, untouched by the destruction below. They twisted and turned, winding their way toward the light of day, toward the world that had long forgotten what lay beneath its feet. The Balrog took a step forward, the ground shaking beneath its weight, molten cracks spreading in its wake. It had been buried once. It would not be buried again, but something stopped it. A presence, faint, distant, but undeniable. The Balrog paused, its its great form motionless for the first time since it had risen. It was not fear that held it in place. Fire knew no fear. It was something else, something it had not felt in an age. It did not know the name of the one who approached, did not care for the titles or histories that mortals carried with them. It only knew that this presence was strong, that it burned not with flame, but with something else, something that had once stood against its kind in a time before memory. It had felt this before, long ago, in the wars of the First Age, when the valor had descended upon the world, when the host of the West had torn down the towers of Morgoth himself. This presence was not them, not the great beings who had cast down its master, but it was something born of that same power, something that stood against the darkness. The air in Moria shifted. The heat that had been building, the fire that had been rising, paused as if waiting. And then, in the far distance, echoing through the ruined halls, came a voice that did not belong to fear, nor to despair, but to challenge. The Balrog turned, the flames around its body surging once more. For the first time since its awakening, it knew what had come. A battle. A true battle. Not against the feeble orcs, not against the scurrying creatures of the dark, but against one who had come to face it. One who had dared to walk into the abyss and call it by name. The fire rose higher, licking the ceiling of the cavern, casting monstrous shadows across the walls. It did not think. It did not hesitate. It only knew one thing. It would burn again.